All right, so our next speaker is Anna Cates. She is an associate professor at the University of Minnesota, and she's our state's first soil health specialist. Her research focuses on soil organic matter cycling and storage in various cropping systems. And welcome, Kate, or Anna. Thank you.
I'm going to talk today about carbon intensity scoring, which I use the acronym right in my title, and what has an effect on that scoring, and then a little bit about how that relates to other ways of monetizing conservation practices. I am part of what we call the Minnesota Office for Soil Health, which is a Board of Water and Soil Resources funded effort, comes from Clean Water, Land, and Legacy Amendment funds. That funds part of my position and part of Marcella Lewandowski's position, and our goal is to increase adoption of soil health practices on row crop acres for water quality outcomes. So obviously this is not very much about water quality today, but as you said, my background is in soil carbon research, and hence I have been tasked with becoming an expert on these sort of environmental economics issues. Today I'm going to draw heavily on some resources I got from an NDSU extension economist who is an economist, and use that to supplement what I know and understand about monetizing these practices. I'm sure you've seen a lot of the opportunities out there. My goal today is to kind of help you differentiate among some of those opportunities and talk about what is going to be most effective at generating income. So the reason why we have these opportunities is because we do have greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture. You might look at this pie chart first on the left, all agricultural um, emissions, and then on the right, some sort of zoom ins of some important ones, and be like, well, I don't really know where I fit into that. So this is my goal is to help you understand a little bit about how different practices fit into emissions. So the reason why there is monetization is because there's a desire to reduce these emissions for uh, greenhouse gas purposes. And it does make sense because adding something like cover crops to your operation does cost something. This is from a SARE survey several years ago now, where they looked at how many years someone was cover cropping and they added up some input savings. They estimated a kind of minor amount of input savings in the first year, but increasing by the fifth year. That's moving in years of cover cropping from left to right there. And then they have a net return here. And the net return in that first year is definitely negative, and that third year is average. And then the fifth year, you start actually seeing an increase in return based on using cover crops, because really your savings have to cover the cost of your use. So that's why paying people to grow cover crops makes a lot of sense from the farm economic side. I do always want to point out, though, that cover crops don't always depress income in the form of yield. This is a bunch of data from the Practical Farmers of Iowa on-farm trial network. And the way you read these pie graphs is they looked at corn yields over their first couple of years of trials, and they found that in 70% of site years, there was no difference in the yield between cover cropped and not cover cropped fields. And then on the other side, they have several more site years. I think this is representing kind of early adoption or people with less experience with cover crops. And this is representing people who kind of know what they're doing and are kind of able to manage the cover crop system effectively. Hide my meeting controls. And you can see that most of the time, again, there's no change in yield. And uh, in a couple cases, there's an increase with the cover crop, and in a couple cases, there's a decrease with the cover crop. So yes, cover crops cost something. No, they don't necessarily detract from the total income of the farm. Tillage is the other one I want to show, and this is a very boring figure. Any of you guys could pull this out of Finbin yourselves, but just wanted to make the point that the gross return per acre for various tillage systems, particularly for soybean, is higher for a minimum till, a no-till, or a strip till system compared to a chisel plow system. So these practices sometimes need a little extra boost in cash in order to make them cash flow on your farm, but not always. Um, So here are some options for getting that extra cash flow. And here I'm going to introduce my friend Matthew Gammons. I hope if you have complicated economics questions, you will just start composing an email to him now. I'll bring up his email again at the end of the slide or at the end of the whole presentation. But several of these slides that have this green formatting are from him, which I'm really grateful for. So the three pathways to monetization, one is to sell carbon credits to any random company. So there was recently a big headline that Microsoft bought a bunch of carbon credits from Indigo Ag. Microsoft doesn't do anything with corn and soybeans. They are buying those carbon credits in order to reduce their in-company carbon footprint. The second pathway, I think, is a little bit um, easier to understand. This is where a company like ADM or Cargill realizes that a big part of their carbon footprint is using land in certain ways. And they think, well, if we use the land in different ways and reduced its impact on greenhouse gases, then we would claim a lower carbon footprint. And so if you are selling to one of these companies, if you're associated with their supply chain, then maybe you get a premium for lower carbon footprint practices. The last one that I'm mostly going to focus on is these policy markets. And I love that Matthew framed this as that the buyers of the carbon credits in this case are ultimately the government. The government is saying we are going to set up policies that incentivize low carbon farming, low carbon practices, and they do that through tax credits, or in the case of the um, low carbon fuel standard in California, essentially just strict regulation, right? Um, so that is the one we're mostly going to focus on, although there's some of what I'm going to talk about is certainly relevant to thinking about carbon offsets. Those are essentially when you're selling your own soil carbon. So I'm using the term carbon footprint and carbon intensity a little bit interchangeably. Carbon intensity is going to be a specific numeric score based on specific models out there, but I think it's easier to conceptualize as a carbon footprint. Usually we think of the carbon footprint as the carbon dioxide emitted either per unit of fuel produced, so presuming that grain is going towards corn ethanol production, or per bushel of grain. So that's the kind of units you can expect is the total CO2 produced per unit of energy or grain that comes out. So it's not a carbon credit, it's not a carbon market, it's not specifically related to storing carbon in your soil, although that comes into it. So storing carbon in your soil is a component of your carbon footprint, but unlike those offset programs or a market where you are selling a credit to Microsoft, it's not only tied, that's it. It's not only tied to the carbon that's in your soil. All right. So these policy markets, this is a little bit more detailed, probably more than we need, but helpful of Matthew to provide it for sure. Um, so there's a couple different ways to think about this. In the California example, companies must participate in order to comply with the law. So that's this cap and trade market. Companies must buy credits by law to meet regulatory mandates. On the tax incentive side, this is what 45Z is. We have essentially a company can choose to participate in order to make more money themselves, to receive these subsidies or benefits. So we hope that I like this sentence that Matthew has on here too. We think that policy markets will be more stable and predictable than voluntary markets. So if the government policy sticks behind this, I know that many of you who have been following this for a while are thinking 45Z, stable and predictable. That's the last thing this has been for the last several years. And I acknowledge that I'm still giving a presentation on 45Z in an environment where the rules have not totally been set. But if the rules are set, we anticipate that this could be more stable than a carbon market, which is driven by supply and demand. So if Microsoft decides they don't care about their carbon footprint anymore, there is no more demand. The market evaporates essentially. Okay, so now I'm going to get into more detail about carbon intensity scoring. This is similar to what I said before. The default corn carbon intensity score is around 29. You can get to lower CI scores by stacking practices that we think reduce the CO2 use or the CO2 emitted per unit of energy. So these are some of the practices that lower carbon intensity scores. Nitrogen application ends up being a big part of it, and I'll get more into detail on that. Both reducing your rate and changing fertilizer source, and then sometimes also timing. But of course, as we know from our 4Rs nutrient management, those tend to go together. But your 4Rs are going to be important for lowering your CI. Reducing tillage also tends to lower your CI, both in terms of direct fuel costs and also in terms of potential changes to the soil, and then adding cover crops. Importantly, these all have to be done while maintaining yield. As I showed you previously, I think most of these practices can be done with relatively competitive yields, but because the math is carbon used per bushels output, you'll see that lower yielding systems tend to have lower carbon intensity because we're applying similar amounts of resources, inputs, for less energy coming out. I think my nutrient management colleagues, though, would agree that, matching the inputs to the bushels you're going to get out is sort of a key fundamental framework of nutrient management anyway. So this shouldn't feel like a new concept. It's just that it's sort of being calculated and monetized in a way that it might not be if you're just thinking about how much NP and K you applied. Okay. So I'm going to go through these sources of energy used in production. Fuel is a big one. Transport to storage or ethanol plant is also one. On one of the carbon calculators I have worked with, they do have, how far did you drive to the field and to the plant. Drying can also be use of fuel that you would put in there. The other one is fertilizer. So manufacturing nitrogen fertilizer takes fuel. So this little graphic from the European Union, I think actually shows it really nicely. You've got natural gas used in hydrogen production, which becomes ammonia, and then ammonia is sort of the base product from which urea and UAN are created. So that is why anhydrous ammonia tends to have the lowest carbon intensity score relative to UAN and urea. I didn't look at other fertilizers. I thought these, are the most common by far, and so this was a fair number of fertilizers to consider. The other way that CI can go down is by practices that are likely to reduce nitrous oxide emissions. So here's your little nitrogen cycle. I know this isn't the nitrogen conference, but I think you're allowed to show the nitrogen cycle anyway. Um, uh, they show that industrial fertilizer is going straight into the ammonium pool in the soil, which is converted into nitrate. And that process, nitrification, can have a little leaky side path towards nitrous oxide. And then again, as nitrate is converted back to nitrogen gas, you can have a little leakage, which leads to nitrous oxide. So adding that nitrification inhibitor, so that nitrification is proceeding slowly and at a time where plants will be able to take up this nitrate is a big part of that. And then moving to spring application again, just decreasing the window in which nitrous oxide might be released. Okay, cover crops are an interesting one. They always lower the CI score in any of the calculators, but they actually probably use more fuel unless you've got a really cool setup where you're seeding as you're combining or something like that. They sometimes also increase nitrous oxide emissions in some of the studies we've done. So the reason why these increase carbon intensity I thought was worth going into a little more. Plus, I'm essentially a soil scientist who's interested in soil carbon, so I did take the opportunity to do a little longer dive into the soil carbon element where I think about it more. So the soil carbon is a matter of how much goes in and how much comes out. Essentially, what goes into the soil in carbon is coming in through photosynthesis. The plant is pulling that carbon from the atmosphere and taking it down into the soil. And then the output is microbial respiration. That's really the big one. You can calculate that on a daily basis. I know Jody sometimes has showed some cool data where she looks at how much microbial respiration happens right after a tillage pass, which can be really dramatic. But essentially, when you're thinking about did the practice increase soil carbon, you need to have more photosynthesis than you do respiration on an annual basis, essentially. So when you think about more soil carbon going in, these are the ways you could increase that. One is just by leaving residue in place. when you mix up the residue into the soil with tillage, obviously you have the same amount of residue as you did before, but you speed up that microbial respiration process. The other way we increase inputs is just by having more biomass in our crops. So corn has more biomass than soybean, and I'll show you a little bit of data that kind of fleshes that out. The other way I think about it is by having more strategic inputs. So more roots, more cover crops, and I'll show you a little bit about why that is important. So here's some data from Josh Gamble, which essentially looks at just the question of how much residue helps increase carbon. So the way you look at this figure is that each panel represents a different crop: alfalfa, grain, corn, silage corn, and soybean. The blue bars represent what carbon came into the system via photosynthesis. So alfalfa and grain corn are a little bit ahead of silage maize and then especially ahead of soybean. And then the orange bars represent a combination of harvest, so stuff that's leaving the field because that's the point of growing the crop is that I'm taking something off the field. And then soil respiration is the slightly darker orange that's closer to the bar. And they're shown as negative because this zero line is kind of we're representing the soil system. So what's added to the soil system and what's lost. And the red bar represents essentially addition, this carbon gained minus the carbon loss. And you can see that all of these systems are negative, or in the case of this grain maze, we would probably call that around zero because its error bars overlap with zero, like Paolo talked about. It's not just the average that's important, but it's the variability that you see. And in this case, average is about zero. So essentially, the system that has or the crop year that has the most biomass production is closest to net neutral on a carbon balance. The soybean year is a little bit negative, the silage year is quite negative, and then the alfalfa year is a little bit negative. Manure is in here. I did not bring that up. Manure is a great source of carbon to the system. You can see how that kind of works out with these figures from the same paper. So here they just talk about the residue carbon, so how much is left on the field versus the carbon balance, and the graph goes up essentially as you have more residue left on the field, you have a closer to zero carbon balance. Again, the corn grain is going to be the systems that have a lot of residue left on the field. This bottom figure is a little bit more complicated because this axis along the bottom is the ratio between how much manure went in versus how much harvested carbon you had. So it's essentially how much can your manure replace what you're harvesting in terms of alfalfa and silage. That is, the reason we do alfalfa and silage is to feed animals. And so it makes a lot of sense to focus on those systems. They're the usual places where manure is applied. And it looks like if you get close to, putting in at least half as much carbon in manure as you take off in silage or alfalfa, you can get closer to that carbon balance of zero. So all is not lost in a forage system where obviously removing a lot of residue is important to the whole point. If you replace a lot of it with manure. I'm not going to talk that much about manure. Manure is in some of the carbon calculators. It's still, I think, a point of contention in how the rules will be written for 45Z. So I am not totally sure how adding manure is going to be part of your CI score right now. From the perspective of a soil scientist, adding manure is great for your soil carbon, and in my opinion, should be part of the calculation. But I think one of the reasons they don't is because animals, as you maybe noticed on that pie chart and have read before, present a lot of trade-offs. If we essentially have more animals producing more manure, there's a lot of opportunity to build soil carbon. More animals also create more methane emissions, which are a potent greenhouse gas, plus potential phosphorus loading from the water quality side. If you think about animals as driving acres going into perennials in terms of hay or pasture land, that's great for our soil carbon. But if you have animals that are raised on pasture, they take a longer time to get to market, and again, more methane emissions. So I think that one of the reasons they don't have animals as explicitly represented in some of the calculators I've seen is because these trade-offs are hard to quantify. Yeah, it just gets more complicated. Okay, a little bit about why roots are important. This is data from a couple of different studies where they added a label to the plant as it was photosynthesizing, and they were able to see how much of the above ground residue and below ground residue remained in the soil after one season. This is in percent carbon, but you can consider that, that plant residue is at least half carbon. So when you think about how much of the carbon is left, that's the same as how much of the plant is left. So in one study, they found about 13% of the above ground residue remaining and about half of the below ground residue remaining. And in another, I think that was a tomato system. So that's a little bit of an oddball, but they had only 4% of the above ground residue remaining and half of the below ground residue. So you can, see more of that above ground residue and more easily maybe conceptualize it adding to your organic matter pool. But the below ground residue is what really sticks around. And that is because of this partnership with microbes in the soil. Roots are sort of pumping carbon into the soil while they are alive. And then the dead cells of roots are really a great source of organic matter. So are cover crops going to be effective at doing this? That is really the obvious way we have of increasing the amount of time we have photosynthesis in an annual crop rotation. So a little data about cover crops and soil carbon. This data on the left is data from my PhD where I measured how much carbon went into the whole system. This is above and below ground carbon, and I have yellow for corn and blue for cover crop. We had an oddball perennial bluegrass cover crop system, and then we had rye and a no cover system. And certainly the cover crop added a little bit of biomass, but relative to how much the maize did, it was somewhat of a wash. And then this one on the right, I think, is from that same paper that Josh Gamble did, where he looked at the carbon balance. They only had cover crops, I think, 1 or 2 years of their study, so they weren't able to include it in the carbon balance overall. But they did monitor daily respiration, essentially. So as you are looking at this bar graph at 0, that means the amount of carbon coming in is exactly equal to the amount of carbon going out. As you look at the dots below 0, that means that the whole system is essentially losing carbon. You can think of that as respiration being ahead. And then if you think of the top part as where photosynthesis is ahead, you can really see a clear and intuitive pattern where you have a rye plant growing in the blue dots. Photosynthesis gets ahead here in the fall, and then it gets ahead here in the early spring. But while the system with no rye crop, essentially respiration is winning. So what's happening here in the red is just gradual soil warm up as microbes wake up and get really going. And then as you get maize planted and taking off, then again, photosynthesis gets ahead. But the other place that the rye and the no rye system differ is here in the middle of the summer, where essentially you have, I don't know if you can see my cursor, you have higher soil respiration right after maize planting, where the system is essentially respiring through that cover crop that was sitting there, and you're essentially decomposing a lot of that residue rather quickly. So it's not, even though there's a little bit of carbon added to the system with cover crops, there's not a guarantee that that won't also just increase respiration. The other thing is that we just don't produce that much biomass in Minnesota. On the top is some figures from Samantha Wells' interseeding cover crop study. They found they produced about 500 to 1,000 pounds per acre of biomass, which is similar to 500 to 1,000 kilograms per hectare. And then down here is a big meta-analysis of global soil carbon differences, where we see that when you have a lot of biomass, greater than 7 tons per hectare, then you are almost certainly to see a soil carbon stock change. That's what being further to the right on this graph means. And if you are lower than that, then you are less likely to. And notice that the smallest one they have on here is less than 3. I mean, I would say all of our Minnesota cover crop fields, unless you're growing forage or we'll have one of these years where it just gets late to terminate, all of them are less than 3. We aren't trying to grow more than that. So you're going to see less benefits to soil carbon when you have less productivity. This is just a figure showing, well, if you want to increase productivity, you won't need more growing degree days. These are data from a study, let's say a survey where we took pictures of cover crops. So this data on the y-axis represent how much greenness we saw on the surface. And you can see you get more cover crops and more greenness if you have more growing degree days. But in Minnesota, we don't have that many growing degree days before after our harvest period. So when you think about just all the logistics of cover crops, we really are limited to rye, and we're limited to whenever we get done with harvest. This figure shows the soil temperature, and it shows the usual harvest window in this gray. So the soil temperature is going down, down, down during the harvest window in Illinois. But when you get to the end of the harvest window in Illinois, you could potentially still have clover germinate, especially if you happen to, be more in the middle of that harvest window than at the end. In Minnesota, we could have clover germinate maybe at the beginning of our harvest window, but really at the end we're with rye. And rye is a great cover crop. I'm not trashing it. I'm just saying we don't have that many growing degree days to grow a lot of it. Cover crops show other benefits more reliably. Here is a compilation of studies across the Midwest that shows the change in soil carbon with cover crops being kind of a little positive but marginal, and then the change in nutrient runoff with cover crops being dramatic, consistent, almost always, on the right side of the line. So that's why I still think you should pay to grow cover crops, even if they don't always increase soil carbon. This shows the change in erosion with a cover crop and not. These are measured by these little erosion mats on the ground. And we saw this dramatic reduction in sediment movement when we had cover crops in the system. And then I'm just showing you 1 year of data from our wind erosion study, where again, when we have an open winter, this was 23, 24 in Polk County up north, we saw this dramatic reduction in wind erosion where we actually had a cover crop in place. Didn't make as much difference, during the winter, but as soon as the wind got going and the soil was quite exposed, it made a huge difference. Okay, so that's all to say, even though I'm skeptical about cover crops always increasing soil carbon, that is what they are doing in the models of carbon intensity. And while may not always happen for you in your field, I think you will get other benefits from cover crops. And back to carbon intensity, I did some simulations of what the CI score might be for corn grown for ethanol under different situations. I changed the tillage in the system from reduced to conventional to strip till. I put 3 different kinds of fertilizer, timing and rate, and source in here. And we did covers or no cover crop, and we looked at a range of yield because, again, remember, yield is the bottom of the fraction. And keep in mind that the average of 29. So I'm going to show you that data in a couple different ways, and that'll give you a sense of which of these practices have the biggest effect. That red line is your CI score assumed by the model. And then the dots represent the different colored dots represent different corn yield that we modeled. The yellow ones are the low yield, the dark ones are the high yield. And then 3 different panels are the 3 different fertilizer types and timings. And then within that is embedded tillage and cover crop use. So if you see, many yellow dots on here, it's because some of them have different tillage treatments, and I'll show that data explicitly in the next slide. But essentially what this sticks out here is, even though, fall anhydrous has the lowest CI score in the model, that's kind of a minor driver relative to what your yield is, right? And that is expected by the way the math works, but it can have a bit of an effect. And then fertilizer rate is the other thing. So I just put 2 fertilizer rates in here, but you could imagine the dots in between, I'm sure. What does it look like with a higher and a lower fertilizer rate? That lower fertilizer rate tends to lower your CI score, 5, I think it's maybe up to 10 points up here, and maybe more like 5 points as you get lower on the yield. I didn't do a higher rate of side dress UAN because I didn't think that was very, very useful. All right, and here's the management effect on your CI score. The 3 panels are the tillage treatment, and then the 2 columns within that are no tillage versus rye. And in this case, the different fertilizer treatments are sort of embedded in here. So the different yellow dots are the different fertilizer treatments within a conventional tillage with rye situation in this column. And really, it looks like it's going to take, mostly you're going to be able to get under that standard carbon intensity rating by going to a no-till system, according to our simulations. We did this based on the most recent version of the GREET model, put in some estimates around how much fuel it takes to do these different tillage practices. There are numerous calculators out there, so this is not the only way you could calculate this by a long shot. But I think that comparatively, this is a pretty good one. Okay, so I have a few more pieces of data around likely payouts, specifically with 45Z, again, courtesy of Matthew. This just explains that we do think this is still active, but we're not quite sure. He thinks that these are the approximate payouts, about $1 per gallon, about 5 cents per bushel of corn, estimated per CI point. Just the overall structure of this. The 45Z tax credit sends an ethanol plant money if they have low carbon intensity fuel. They have other elements of their carbon footprint besides their sources of corn, but the source of corn can be a pretty major part of their total carbon intensity score. So if the plant wants to incentivize farmers to bring them low CI grain, then they can use that to lower their own CI score and get this tax credit. There's no rule about how the ethanol plant would share this tax credit with farmers. This estimate that I'm going to show you that Matthew built assumed they would share half of it with farmers. So that's an assumption. I expect it will vary by plant should this come into being. These are the things to get ready for a CI-based market. If you think that your ethanol plant will be doing this and you can potentially sell low CI grain, you do need quite a lot of records around your practices, and keeping those detailed records now will be useful. I am going to skip this so I can show these last figures. These are the estimates he built for North Dakota around how much money you could make on different elements of monetizing conservation. And he points out that these are all going to be much lower than EQIP or CSP rates. So put that in your mind as well, that although it's a lot of paperwork, you will still probably make more money on EQIP than you will on these monetization elements. Okay, so this is the estimated 45Z value per bushel of no-till, and I'm going to zoom right in on our neck of the woods. It's much higher up north, and I am honestly not exactly sure why. I wonder if that assumes a change from a lot of tillage to a little tillage, but this is what they estimate the change would be. For cover crops, so just in general, we're looking at around $1, like between 75 cents and $1.50 across Minnesota for the just doing no-till on 45Z. And for cover crops, the overall payout is quite a bit less. I'm seeing like 25 to 50 cents across Minnesota. Harder to see because those colors are so light. And then if you do them together, of course, you get a higher value. And so at that point, you could be looking at more like 50 to 75 cents a bushel for these practices. Corn prices are low, so I don't know if that makes an extra 50 cents, pretty darn appealing. Or if it's like, I'm already barely scraping by. I'm not going to add anything new to get an extra 50 cents a bushel. It's not quite worth it. But that's essentially the range of value that we might see from adding these practices. Okay. So in terms of how I think about monetizing conservation with these particular uh, mechanisms. When you think about selling your soil carbon on the market, I think it might be risky because I don't know that everybody's going to see an increase in soil carbon. So reading that contract, making sure that if you can't get the cover crop planted or if your check-in soil carbon scores are not as high as they think they will be, what happens to you? What happens to funds you've invested? And I think that the CI scoring and tax credits may be a more reliable, consistent way to monetize those good conservation practices, depending again on the implementation at the local level by ethanol plants. Okay, as I said, I was going to show Matthew's contact information one more time. You can get in touch with me, of course, if you have any questions after this. And then maybe this will work for, oh yeah, it worked for the questions. Okay. This is definitely a Lindsay question. How do cover crops impact phosphorus runoff versus nitrate runoff? Um, but I can do it as best I can. So there's a little bit of a disconnect here. You know, the runoff that happens on the surface, there's not as much nitrogen that's leaving via that pathway as via leaching through the soil profile. And cover crops are very effective at taking up nitrate that's in the soil while they're growing. Of course, they don't do it when they're not growing, but they're very effective at taking it up while they're growing. Cover crops slow runoff dramatically. That's what I was showing in terms of uh, the erosion mat study where I just showed that less sediment was moving. I'm sure that water is just moving more slowly in that situation too. That's what all our data shows. There does tend to be higher dissolved phosphorus in systems that have cover crops. We don't know, it's going to really be system by system. We don't know whether the dissolved phosphorus is going to be an important source relative to the phosphorus that might have left in sediment that's prevented from leaving by cover crops. That's going to just depend on that particular system, how vulnerable it is to sediment loss in general, relative to that dissolved reactive phosphorus loss. So there's some trade-offs here. Cover crops definitely slow runoff. There's some cool data out of Kansas where they show how cover crops, when you get a storm event, you don't have as flashy a big peak of runoff. Instead, it's kind of slowed down and shifted later. So you get a smaller peak later. So you essentially are going to have definitely less runoff, which is going to carry less of everything, more chance for infiltration to occur of these nutrients where they can be used in the soil. Yes, the carbon intensity of fertilizer manufacturing is part of the scoring. And our sensitivity analysis on that showed that it was a moderate effect, not as big as tillage. Um, yeah, and not as big as rate. So which I guess does come into that manufacturing score also.
Okay, we are out of time. Let's give Anna a nice hand. Thank you, Anna.
Thanks, everybody.